All right, Dr. Jackson. Well, you're up.
All right. Um, so I have an hour, and it shouldn't take that much. The talk that Jake saw most recently, I put together for USGS, and the whole idea of it was to take these people that are primarily sensor driven and data driven, and bring them into the ecology of why we pay attention to road salt. How does this all work? Why are we doing this? So does this screen look okay to you, Jake, at this point?
It does.
Okay, good. So title of this is Road Salt, What Do We Know About Concentrations, Toxicity, and Implications for Surface and Groundwater. I added at the end, though, some things that we can do, because your organization, unlike USGS, is going to be reacting to the road salt problem. And so I have some suggestions on that front. Why are we not changing? All right. So first thing, and you notice that in the title slide, I work with a lot of people. My knowledge that I'm sharing with you is a function of all this published literature, as well as this is my entomology team. This is our sensor team. And then we have volunteers, individuals and groups of people that are really adding to our overall picture of what this environmental challenge looks like. And I'm doing this in part to let you know that we're fully aware of how you're helping us talk about salt by collecting data that we couldn't collect otherwise. One thing about salt, and I throw this in just to both confuse you and let you know that we're aware of the confusion, and that is when we talk about salt and freshwater, we use all sorts of different terms that are all related. Salinity, TDS, conductivity, specific conductance, salt, chloride, all of these are legitimate measures of salt in the waterway. They're not all redundant, but they're certainly all related. The other thing that I do, I like to do is remind people what and why we talk about salt the way we do. And that is these molecules break apart. The sodium chloride has a cation, or a positively charged particle, and an anion, or a negatively charged particle. And that's why they conduct electricity in water. Distilled water doesn't conduct electricity. You add salt to it and it does. That's why they call it specific conductance or electrical conductivity. So we're breaking up sodium chloride, calcium chloride, magnesium chloride. But remember also calcium carbonate, limestone, that's a salt, and it breaks apart into a positive and negatively charged ion. We've been working with salt for a long time, and we've understood that salt or salinization of fresh water dating back to the early 2000s was really correlated with work we were doing in urban gradients. We were brought in to look at toxicity for mountaintop mining. That's a carbonate salt. And then when they started fracking Marcellus shale, we did some toxicity work. And most people don't realize it, but produced water out of a Marcellus shale well is saturated with sodium chloride, as well as some calcium chloride. So take-home messaging, I give you the message in the beginning and the end, and maybe in the middle, I fill in the blanks. Salt, sodium chloride, in our streams and groundwater, it's increasing, especially in urban streams. We know this well. Current levels of elevated salt can cause physiological stress or even be toxic to aquatic organisms. Brief spikes in the winter are not well understood, but this salt problem isn't just a winter problem. The impact of elevated salt depends on the concentration of the salts, the actual background hardness of the stream, exposure duration to elevated salt, the type of salt, water temperature, and the species you're talking about being sensitive or less sensitive to salt. And finally, increased road salt use is generally not considered human health, in other words, drinking water, infrastructure challenges, in other words, roads and bridges, or where we fall in, environmental impacts. Why is there all this interest in salt? It's because our streams are becoming saltier. One of the first papers I'm aware of is actually out of my backyard outside of Philadelphia. And it was, the data set was available because one of the guys, Chris Crockett, an author here, worked for the Philadelphia Water Department. And this is Philadelphia water intake out of the Schuylkill River. And you can see both sodium and chloride doubled between 1973 and 1999. So by 1999, the data were showing that salt was increasing. This was long before anyone started talking about it in our area or in science in general. But there's actually a huge gap in that conversation. Way back in 1970, the first reference at the top here, you'll see this is a National Academy of Science and Engineering report on the effects of de-icing salts on water quality and biota. So in 1970, 2 years before the Clean Water Act, they were aware that road salt had the potential to be a problem. How come that never got to the rest of us? I don't know. Look at 4 more papers in the 70s asking about environmental impacts of road salt. And so the scientists in the 70s saw road salt happening and they were on top of it, but the rest of us weren't. This is the paper that got everyone's attention in 2005. It's very similar basically to the data that came out of the Philadelphia area. Everywhere they looked, they were finding elevated salt. And it was increasing at an alarming rate. Those of you that are collecting your own data, though, may notice that these concentrations maxing out at 40 or 50, 30 or 40, over here up to 100. I mean, we've measured concentrations as high as 500. These are low, and that's because these are at USGS gauging stations. They tend to be downstream. It's increasing because our road salt use is increasing. This is an updated figure of road salt use in million metric tons in the United States. So we start in the 40s and 50s with next to nothing. It levels out around 1970. You can see where the Clean Water Act is. And then to the mid 90s, it was pretty stable, around 10, which was 5 times what we were using pre-1960. But still, compared to today, where now we're up around 25 million metric tons a year, which is 12 times. And remember, this is every year, not once, every year. So what's happening is all that salt is basically going into our water. So these are 3 streams close to the Stroud Center. The black dots here are the water at White Clay Creek. It's a small rural stream, 2 roads. And we haven't seen salt concentration change since 1968 when our data began. That's when we were founded. The nice thing about these other 2 data sets is they extend back to the 60s or even into the 40s. The blue dots are the Brandywine Creek and the red dots are Valley Creek. These are all in the same county. What they represent, though, are different degrees of urbanization. So the most urbanized stream has seen its background at the base go up to 150, whereas when it got started down here in the late 60s, it was down, at 10. So it's gone up 15-fold or 30-fold over time. And if you think of it around here, we tend to think background was probably 5. So if you went from 5 to 150, that means you've gone up 30-fold. And the key to it all is the landscape that would be salted. So primarily parking lots and roads. Even though I knew based on our sampling that we had a groundwater contamination, and I knew this for a decade, it wasn't until 2019 that I really started worrying about it or thinking about it. We started a project with 5 sensors, just like the sensors you're using, by a master's student around a small city, Westchester in Pennsylvania here. And she was also a volunteer monitor. That's what the Chester County Master Watershed Stewards are. And just to get started, we had her grab some samples, and these are the data, these 5 sites. And the thing that jumps out at you that I want you to notice is, first of all, This is September, late September. They're not applying road salt. They haven't applied road salt in probably close to 8 months, maybe 6 months, but a long time. So base flow, September, lots of salt, over 400 milligrams at one site, 350 at another site. And at the same time, if we went to White Clay Creek at the Stroud Center, we'd be down here at 10 to 15 at the most. The second thing that jumped out at me is the EPA doesn't have an updated standard, but from 1988, the standard that they use of 230, two of these sites was violating that chronic standard at the time we sampled, and the day before that, and the day before that, and for the weeks and weeks after that. This standard was set up to be a 4-day exposure that was allowed to be observed once every 3 years. So you're talking about over 900, over 1,000 days. And the truth is, in these streams, the only time it was less than this would have been during a rain event. Otherwise, these streams were at or above this chronic standard. And so clearly salt was stressing these streams all the time. At the same time, we were putting in these sensors, just like you're using. And one of the earliest ones we put in is in First State National Historic Park, just south of us in Delaware. These are draining some urbanized areas. This was the first place that we measured salt peaking during the winter. So we knew we had elevated conductivity, say 12 to 1500, but then we spiked. And this is a 4-day running average. This spike went over 40,000 microsiemens per centimeter. Seawater is at 50 to 55,000. So our first winter, which was 2017, 2018, we suddenly knew here and at our Westchester sensor that we can see concentrations that are comparable to seawater in a freshwater system. Another partner put in a sensor in an area that he knew he had a problem. And this was data that was just pulled out last year, January 2022. He measured 3 peaks. All 3 were at or above seawater. And actually, one of them was twice as salty as seawater. It peaked at 106,000 microsiemens per centimeter. What does that mean in terms of chlorides? So we peaked out at chlorides at over 40,000 milligrams per liter. So those that are using the test strips know what that means. That's really, really high concentrations. So that's the temporal variability, and that's a great concern. And we are worried about those spikes in part because nobody knows what they mean. Even our bioassays, we've never jolted an animal with seawater for 4 hours and then said, what happens? Or for 8 hours. And then say, does it survive? We know they don't behave normally, but we don't know what it means in terms of their survival, much less just their ability to hang out. Do they basically drift? But we started getting interested in the spatial variability because you can't put out sensors everywhere. It's not feasible. So snapshots, that's what we call these salt snapshots, allow us to localize our salt concentration. Because if you have a sensor that's somewhere where people are not living, they just kind of zone out in the conversation because you're not showing them a data point that's in their backyard. And that's what we're trying to do here, is give them a data point in their backyard. So these are 3 different watersheds where we've worked with volunteer groups to do a high density sampling within a day or 2 days, where we can hit 30 or 50 or over 100 sites, trying to get in a snapshot at base flow. Notice the dates: October, November, January. And in the case of January of last year, we'd had no winter events, so we had no salting going on. These are all groundwater contamination, spatial variability. This is what the data look like. We just plotted them up. And in all cases, we start getting peaks somewhere. Our highest concentrations are in the 180 to 300. Now over here we went up to 550. Notice on the low end, we really have a hard time getting below 50. We had some dry channels. This is a limestone area, and we had one that was at 30. Same thing as here. We got into some rural areas around this town and got some measures that were in the 20 to 40 range. But everywhere else, we're measuring significant salt. So I drew in here the 230, the EPA chronic threshold, but then I also drew in two other numbers, or another number, 50 milligrams per liter, because both Maryland and Ohio are using that as kind of an indicator of salt contamination. And suddenly when you use that 50, you realize, oh, we've got salt stress almost everywhere where we're doing that. The 230 makes it seem like 10 to 20% of our sites maybe have a problem. When you use the 50, all of our urban streams are experiencing salt stress. So how much is too much? This is where the bioassays come into play. And this is tricky. We've added to this conversation by working with native mayflies. Mayflies we bring right out of White Clay Creek here at the Stroud Center. And being a field station, we can rear these guys right here. And that means we're not relying on rainbow trout or a Chironomus riparius or something like that, that's very happy in the lab, very happy in a beaker, but may not be the most sensitive thing in the world, one of the hyalellas. We've reared a lot of different species completely in the lab. We take them from the egg to the larvae to the adult. Much of what we work with are betids. They're very easy to do. We can get a complete life history in depending on the temperature, in 20 to 40 days. And what we've done with these is created dose response curves. And some of the data that I use here would be expressed like this, where we have survivorship. And if we have no salt, then everybody survives 100%. And if we have a lot of salt, in this case, 8,000 milligrams chloride, then everybody dies. And what you look for is the 50 percentile, the LC50, lethal concentration that results in 50% mortality. And when you can find that, that's a number that everybody can talk about and compare. So we looked at the age of the animals, the duration of the exposure, the stream site type, so freestone versus limestone, or low conductivity versus high conductivity waters, naturally speaking, species that are involved, and then temperature. And what we found, all of these are important. All of them are significant. But the most important things was duration, how long they were exposed to salt. Longer was more toxic. The stream's type, in other words, the less hard the water, or let's reverse it, the harder the water, the less toxic the salt. So a limestone stream can absorb more salt than a freestone. And finally, toxicity of the salt increases with temperature. So those winter spikes may be less important because the water's near freezing versus in the summer where it might be 15 to 25 degrees. One thing we didn't look at was different kinds of salt. We've only worked with sodium chloride, but those of you who've looked into these salting products, notice that magnesium chloride and calcium chloride are also frequently sold. And in many cases, you have mixtures of magnesium chloride and sodium chloride. And for invertebrates, as well as fathead minnow, magnesium chloride was more toxic than sodium chloride. So not all salts are equal. These are just acute tests. But remember, we were spiking to 40,000 milligrams per liter chloride, and the LC50 here is 800 to 2,800. So maybe these spikes do matter to some of these guys, but that's not correcting for a temperature near zero. So we took the data. This is the Canadians did a nice analysis back in 2011 of the available short-term and long-term exposures. And their long-term threshold they picked out was in the around 120 milligrams per liter versus their short-term exposure or acute exposure would be 640 milligrams per liter. Well, then we took that, and those are, the nice thing about this is you know exactly where the numbers came from, and they're updated relative to 1988. We plotted our mayfly data on those same plots. The blue ones are mayflies in hard water versus mayflies in soft water. And why does it do that? Something's going on. But what jumps out at you is in no matter what, these mayflies, as you well know, end up being quite sensitive. And mayflies and juvenile mussels are changing the conversation about salt sensitivity because new data are coming in. And that may be why we haven't had a new federal standard, is trying to adjust for all these factors that we now know are important. This is a correlation that was my eye opener 20 years ago, and that is just a macroinvertebrate score. This is one that ranges from 0 to 20, where 20 is a great stream and 0 is a lousy stream. And I just plotted the bug scores versus conductivity. You never get conductivity down to 0, but you can get it down in under 100. Those are very dilute waters and generally are draining very forested waterways. And as you increase, you find that the stream degrades. One thing that jumps out at you is look at this conductivity. It's peaking out at 500, 550, which might only be 80, 85 milligrams per liter chloride. So it didn't take a lot of chloride if that was the only stressor, and we know it's not. That's why it's important to remember a correlation may not equal causation. The mantra of science, but often not shared with you as volunteers. Be careful with these correlations. So how much is it's too much? That answer is still unclear. We know more than we used to, but it's not going to be a simple number. And that's probably what's slowing down the conversation. One of our complications is we deal in a world where we're learning about other new, what we would call emerging contaminants. Emerging means we need more information, whether it's bactericides, personal care products, insecticides, herbicides, even PAHs and PFAS fall into this category of things we just need more information about. Some of these emerging contaminants are tied to roads. De-icing salts are one of them. pHs from coal tar sealants is one. And the latest hot item and one that could haunt us all is 6-ppd, which is highly toxic to salmonids. It was discovered in Washington, but the data that, and you can see the first paper was 2020. Well, since then, they found just additional data that says this stuff, which comes out of the tire, is really toxic to salmonids. But one we know more about more than any of these is really road salt. And that's because of we measure how much we apply, and we measure its impact in the waterways through our conductivity meters out there. So when we talk about urban runoff and we talk about sewer, we have to remember, yes, we have salt problems, but we have all these other contaminants, oils, metals, sealants, herbicides, insecticides, soaps. All of these things are hitting our waterways, and you have to be very careful. And I'm struggling constantly with our volunteers to remind them that urban runoff is a chemical cocktail. If you read about what the freshwater salinization syndrome is, they say it right there. It's a chemical cocktail, of which one of the components is salt. It may be the most important, it may not be. In all likelihood, it's just one of many. Here's a study that was published in 2019 of 50 road runoff events, 21 sites across the United States. The median site, this is done by USGS, looking at all these different chemicals that they were able to measure in this road runoff. 71 on average per site. The two biggest groups, pesticides and polyaromatic hydrocarbons. So these are our products of fossil fuel. Could be combustion, could be just tied to a production product. So these are the same points that I gave you at the start. It's increasing. Salt is everywhere, and it increases with your degree of urbanization. Roads and parking lots, primarily. The current levels are clearly, at some sites, going to be physiologically stressful or even toxic. Their brief spikes look to be important, but they're not well understood at all. I don't worry about them as much as I worry about 90 to 150 days a year where the water's hot and salty. The impact of that salt is going to depend on its concentration, but also on the hardness of your waterway, exposure duration. That's why I worry about base flow, as well as the type of salt, the water temperature, and the species that are involved. And there's just a lot to still learn about this. Finally, the increased road salt and this problem, it's amazing when you think about that they were paying attention to it in 1970 before the Clean Water Act. And yet here we're looking at concentrations that have doubled and tripled and quadrupled since the Clean Water Act was passed in front of us. As the dump trucks roll by, nobody stopped and asked the question, is this okay? The trick in this conversation moving forward is to balance the conversation. In other words, to a large degree, no one asked because road safety and keeping the economic engines of the communities moving, schools open, trucks rolling, these were all important, really important, and salt really changed the equation for them. But now we have to talk about our fresh waters becoming salty. We have to talk about accelerated aging of our infrastructure. We have to talk about what it means to have additional salt in your drinking water. Most people don't know that road salt is actually tied to the Flint drinking water problem, which was lead. But how did that lead get mobilized? In part, that was due to switching the drinking water to a water supply that had more salt contamination that then stripped off the scaling in old lead pipes and mobilized the lead. Our area, I estimate conservatively 400 pounds per year per person, 1,200 pounds per year per 3-person household. That's based on state roads, municipal roads, and this is back of the envelope. Funny thing is I did this, and then somewhere along the line, I discovered Michigan had done something like it. I couldn't find the details, but they came up with a very similar number. So 400 pounds. That's almost a pallet of rock salt if you went to Home Depot per 2 households per year. If you go to a neighboring stream, so this was the stream I showed you some data on. It's by the Stroud Center, has a USGS gauge on it. We calculated that 37,000 tons of salt flow by this museum. That's 80 pallets per day, 200,000 tons or pounds per day, 37,000 tons per year. That's 10 truckloads, a 10-ton truck dumping into the river right there at this bridge every year or every day. Or if you lined up those trucks in 1 year, it's a line of trucks 17 miles long. We just use so much salt. When I talk about salt, nobody's surprised that we have a problem. So what do? These are my recommendations, and they parallel what other people say. We're going to need to use more muscle in machines, more calibrated attacks, more friction and traction, more reasonable expectations. We can't just keep doing this. And certification programs seem really advised. So what does it mean? Muscle in machines. Well, what we did is we relied on muscle in machines for years and then replaced it with magic of chemistry. And we need to go backwards and go back, and that there's going to be some resistance to that, but there's no escaping every time we put salt on a roadway, on a parking lot, some of that ends up in our groundwater. It will only go up if we don't use less. One of the magic that we've seen around here is Maryland cut their salt use in half just by brining almost entirely. They use very little rock salt. 50%, roads were clean earlier. So it was more effective. Now, Maryland's not Michigan, but they learned something, and they have a lot more ice storms than you guys have. So it may also apply. Out of the Adirondacks in New York, they moved to live edge blade snow plows, and they swear by these things. And you'll notice the segmentation. It's a more effective plow. Better calibration, actually knowing how much you're applying. That's a better truck, a smart truck. Around here, the state has the best trucks where they're measuring temperature, road temperature, air temperature, the type of precipitation, volume, traffic. They have satellite information coming in, but the key, this is out of Toronto, is you want to apply this much based on what's recommended versus this much, which is what it may take to make it appear like, oh yeah, I've done enough. That's 140 grams per meter squared versus 27 times the salt that was required. Friction and traction, going back to the good old days, snow tires, chains, anti-skid aggregates, things like that I grew up with in Colorado. That's where we got this sign for the chain law. In effect, you can't go over the passes if you don't have chains on. And it's about expectations, less about being a runway and a speedway, the highway being a runway and a speedway in the middle of a winter storm. That's just a crazy expectation. But that's to some degree what our transportation departments are responding to, is an expectation of clean roads no matter how bad the storm. Finally, the certification program. This is especially important because, and we don't have good numbers on this, but I would guess that anywhere between 25 and 50% of our road salt challenge is coming from private property, where private applicators, it's not the state, it's not the municipality, it's private applicators, getting them on board. And we've all seen it where the whole parking lot is white. The per unit area, they are way over applying quite often. And they don't know otherwise. And the certification program, New Hampshire has it, Minnesota has it, Madison, Wisconsin has it. There's a number of them that are out there. The neat thing about New Hampshire is they attached a limited liability assurance for private applicators who went through their certification training program. And the more often we see something like that, I think the better we get buy-in from these private applicators. Eventually, though, our only answer is going to be this. We can slow down the rate of salt increase, but reversing it is going to be hard. Because like I said, every time we put salt down, some of that is going to go into our groundwater. And that's going to be a 20 or 30 year turnaround, depending on where you're at, 15 to 30 years, depending on your aquifer. But once we get to the Jetsons, then we won't care whether there's salt or ice or snow on the roads because it won't be necessary. That's all I have.
Thank you.
I can quit sharing too.
Thanks, Dr. Jackson. That was super interesting and very relevant to a lot of the places where we're monitoring. We're definitely seeing concentrations, that sustained year-round concentrations at concerning levels in our more developed watersheds where we're monitoring. And I know this is on the radar of a lot of the groups that we're working with. So yeah, I really appreciate that comprehensive look at the science and sharing your experience there. So yeah, at this point, I think let's open it up for questions. You should be able to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question verbally, or if you want to type something in the chat, feel free to do so.
All right, I answered all the questions.
Yes, so. Yes, so.
I have a question, Jacob. I'm wondering if you've done anything to look at like measuring how much is traveling through groundwater, or if there's a way to look at that yet, or what your thoughts are on the groundwater piece versus the runoff.
Well, no. You know, your groundwater fields are going to be so variable across your landscapes. That's not an insignificant effort. And this, we're only talking about that shallow groundwater. The thing to remember, and most people don't think about it this way, is if you haven't had a rain or snow event in a few days, every drop of water you see in a stream is groundwater. So it's not about the volume per se. For me, it's really about the fact is that it's always there and it's always salty. That the volume of your groundwater is going to be a challenge in terms of say you were able to cut your salt level in half. First thing you're going to do is slow down the increase, but it's going to take a long time before you reverse direction. And that's because that's going to depend on the size of your groundwater pool.
Yeah. So yeah, if you're seeing those sustained high conductivity levels year round, yeah, we're effectively measuring the groundwater there. We haven't directly, we haven't put in wells and directly measured concentrations in groundwater, at least through my program. Something we've talked about doing a few here and there, but yeah, those base flow measurements really tell us a lot.
The one thing I would always, and with our volunteers, we always do is every site gets a full professional certified lab water chemistry analysis, so that you actually know what you're looking at above and beyond specific conductance and maybe a chloride strip. It really does pay to know how hard your water is. In other words, it's, when we talk about freestone and limestone, that's just a gradient, and they can vary immensely. And the only way to get, I need to see all that before I can really talk about what the character of a stream is.
Right. And yeah, we aren't doing any full suite sampling at our sites. It's just more of a funding and capacity issue, though groups may be doing that on their own. We have done some chloride strip sampling in some targeted areas. But I can definitely provide guidance to people if that's something they're interested in looking into for their watersheds. I see a question. It says, any comments on monitor placement? We have two, but it seems that one upstream and one downstream of road crossings is desirable. I'll just quickly say, a lot of times this is really a cumulative impact from lots of road crossings. There may be cases where it's a really discrete input that may be causing road salt pollutions, but often it's more of a death by 1,000 cuts scenario where there are lots of inputs. And I think that's where that sort of snapshot day approach makes a lot of sense. We can only place so many sensors, but we can go out and take samples at a lot of different sites over the course of the day to kind of find out hot spots. We've done this in Buck Creek. And if there are other areas where we have road salt concerns, I can support that as well. Let's see. So will this presentation be made available? I will share a recording, and then, John, if you're willing to share a PDF of your slides, and, I'm sure we can get that out to everybody. All right, John, it said, what are thoughts on rain gardens? They are meant to reduce runoff and enhance retention in groundwater. Is this creating a long-term problem with salt in groundwater?
Yes. And whoever asked that question is on top of something that nobody wants to talk about right now, and that is all of our green stormwater infrastructure in areas where road salt's being actively applied are basically forcing in the winter a greater proportion of their road and parking lot salt into the groundwater. There's no getting around it. That's the purpose of those, just as you described, is to infiltrate stormwater. And therefore, when that stormwater is salty, that means we're forcing and therefore are making our salt problem worse. They're aware of that. The other thing that is happening also is the salt, it has this ability to mobilize other pollutants. So we are sending other road and parking lot related pollutants deeper into the soils around those infiltration basins.
Jake, I think it's important though to counter that argument to a certain extent, in that stormwater management in a whole watershed is more than just the introduction of salt into groundwater. The problem is the amount, as Dr. Jackson said, the amount of salt we apply. But thanks to suits with the second introduction of the Clean Water Act, the quality and the total quantity of a lot of the runoff from stormwater got stripped. And I think a lot of it has to do with municipality lawsuits originating here in Michigan. So it's damned if you do and damned if you don't, because if you don't put reinfiltration to groundwater, such as they have done near major parking lots in Grand Rapids, you have no way to require the total reduction of quantity of stormwater going downstream. The only recourse most people have, or property owners have, is to sue the people upstream. There is no good governance thanks to the limited effect of the Clean Water Act. Now, prove me wrong, but it's not the problem. It's just rain gardens are not the problem. It's the application of salt into those areas that go into it.
Yeah, no, your last sentence said it all, and that is whether it's a rain garden or however you phrase it, the main idea of these infiltration basins is to absorb pollutants in the soils that underlie that basin. Road salt, sodium chloride, is unique in that it is not entrained in that soil organic matter layer, passes right through. They are not designed to deal with road salt. They're not failing to deal with road salt because they're not designed to deal with road salt. And the truth is there's no easy way of doing it. And I see the question that just popped up about plants and plant removal. Think about how many pounds are going into a parking lot. There is no way to plant anything that's going to effectively remove this salt. You wouldn't think about it if it was phosphorus or nitrogen. It's just, that's the thing that's so startling, is how much salt we're applying on our landscapes. 400 pounds per person per year. There's no easy way of dealing with that. Our only real solution is to use less of it.
So we got another question. It says, are aquifers being monitored with any regularity? Here in generally, I would say no. Even streams are not being monitored with any regularity, hence the need for Enviro DIY and expanding the coverage of streams that are where we're collecting, relevant data to this issue. There are the state in Michigan are doing some chloride related monitoring in some targeted watersheds. I believe mostly in streams. They could be doing some aquifer monitoring as well, but I would say generally no. John, I don't know if it's similar in Pennsylvania. I would assume so.
They're monitoring what they can with the resources that they have. And
Right.
whenever I talk to the public, I always say, if you want more information, pay more taxes. These environmental regulators are starved in terms of their ability to collect the data that they need. What I can tell you is, no doubt they're monitoring some wells, just like they're doing some streams, more than we know, but less than they would like. However, where studies have been designed, for example, there was a study that was done in New York, where they looked at wells. They were in an area that was developed, but was still on drinking water wells. They found significant drinking water well contamination, maybe 10% passing the 250 drinking water standard for chloride, and maybe 90% were passing or had exceeded the 20 milligrams per liter sodium for a low sodium diet. There are some areas in New Jersey now where lawsuits have been waged where road salt being too near one of these storage facilities has resulted in private drinking water contamination. So this is the area, I think, where there needs to be more conversation. In other words, it's in your drinking water. We've had people. Now you have to avoid water softeners, but we've done analyses for people, and their water is coming straight out of a river, but the river's in an urban area, and it has way more salt than they knew. And that's now. And if we don't start doing something now, in 20 years, our problem will be twice as bad. So we're 50 years into the Clean Water Act, and the road salt was being applied for the best of intentions, but now we know we have a problem that accompanies the use of road salt in its current form, and our only choice is to change that, or else the problem will just get worse.
All right, we got another question and a response here. I'll read, and then John, feel free to jump in and provide your input. So, do you support the use of alternatives to road salt such as beet juice? I assume higher costs are a stumbling block there. And then we had a response that beet juice, this being beet juice, raises BOD. That's what is that? Biological oxygen demand and in surface water and groundwater, and the latter can produce and decrease oxygen levels in surface water and groundwater. The latter can produce catastrophic results by releasing metals at toxic levels for drinking water and surface water. Any comments on that?
So the first thing about the discussion about alternatives is knowing what you're really looking at. And that's not always easy to do. But so when people refer to beet juice, sometimes it's 100% beet juice, and sometimes it's basically either a rock salt that's been treated, or it's a brine that's both magnesium chloride, sodium chloride, as well as beet juice. There is a fair bit of salt in there, not at all insignificant. So that's a really tricky conversation to have. And when people are marketing, and I've listened to the marketing spiel, it's really hard for me to advise unless they tell you exactly what's in the stuff. And remember that if they're just using better calibrated applications, but applying the same amount of road salt that would be recommended for your township, say, but the township or municipality just doesn't have a good dump truck, and so they're over applying, you still get to the same outcome. So when people ask me about alternatives, I haven't found one that satisfies me. If it's a lot of beet juice or various ammonia products, they're adding either nitrogen or phosphorus or both. It's not simple.
All right, we got probably get a few more in here. Have there been any comparative studies between limestone parking lots versus paved and drained parking lots?
In what way?
I would assume into how they contribute salt.
I'm not aware of any. I'm not aware of anybody that's looked at porous asphalt or porous concrete versus standard asphalt and concrete. But anything that allows for better infiltration is going to allow, during the melt, more salt into the groundwater versus running off. The better you control your runoff, the greater proportion of your road salt is going to end up in groundwater.
What about the use of more sand?
I think abrasives, increasing traction, and snow tires. I gave a presentation in Central PA to about 150 conservation district employees, and I asked them, raise your hand if you've bought snow tires, and a handful had. I asked, raise your hand if you bought snow tires in the last 10 years. None of them have. So some of these things, whether it's tires, if you were to go in Europe, and Europe doesn't have the road salt problem we do, they have mandatory winter tire transfer dates and things like that. Going back to some of those alternatives to increase our traction might be part of this equation. Also using abrasive. So they quit using sand as much because if you have a sediment TMDL, the sand is adding to that problem. Now, some people have been using shale, crushed shale, and other people limestone. And the nice thing about the limestone is, of course, it's under some condition, it's going to dissolve versus the sand, which will go nowhere. So there may be some alternatives there. It's going to be a combination, I think. And then you're going to spend money cleaning up after winter because you put down a bit of a mess.
Well, we're a minute past the hour here. I know there are additional questions, but perhaps we can follow up with those via email. If you want to send me an email, I can, connect you with John or otherwise. So, but yeah, thank you, John. Appreciate your time today. This was super informative. It seems like we have a really engaged group that saw a lot of value in this information. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Really good questions. Really, really good questions. So thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.